To many of us Americans, one of the most strikingly negative features of communist society is the fact that the communist citizen has his or her career chosen at an early age by the state according to its perceived needs. Now, in the 1990s America, the Clinton administration and federal and state legislators are teaming up to foist on American students a system with the potential for a similar draconian, micromanaged society. If these social engineers have their way, free choices in career selection and access to the job market are going to be increasingly restricted according to the whim and dubious wisdom of the state. At an early age, students will be tested, and whatever the state decides their capability or their talents lie, they will be channeled into various occupations. Your child, although he or she may wish to become a medical doctor, may find themselves working in a garage as a mechanic for the rest of their life. To the current controversy over national education standards, the Clinton administration has added a second major education restructuring initiative known as School to Work, or STW. The best way to understand STW and why it has created a national outcry among traditional educators and parents is to examine its background. Plank 10 of Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto provides for a, quote, combination of education with industrial production, end quote. In 1948, a United States House of Representatives committee published 100 Things You Should Know About Communism and Education, which describes what the masterminds of communism have planned for your child in the name of education. He will be trained but not educated. He will be taught to solve problems that are handed to him. People are trained when they learn how to do a particular thing well and can be depended upon to do it, end quote. The next year, 1949, the communists took control of China. And regarding the years 1950 to 1960, Stuart Fraser compiled and edited Chinese communist education records of the first decade, in which one finds, quote, education must be combined with productive labor, end quote, by Lu Tingyi, who stated, and I quote, now this combination of schooling with productive labor has given rise to the campaign to reform school curricula and the efforts to change school systems. Our education is socialist education. Education must serve politics, must be combined with productive labor. The purpose of the training is unified, that is, to train socialist-minded, educated workers, end quote. Theodore Chen, in Communist China, 1949-1969, explained, quote, the primary concern of education is not the acquisition of knowledge, but the remolding of behavior, attitudes, emotions, and thoughts, end quote. In 1960, back in the United States of America, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare published Soviet education programs in 1960, in which the author stated, quote, wherever we went, we felt the pulse of the Soviet government's drive to educate and train a new generation of technically skilled citizens. The USSR plans to bring all secondary school children into labor education and training experiences through the regular school program, end quote. Are our children human beings, ladies and gentlemen? Are human capital? The 1960s were a time of turmoil in the United States. Radical students became members of organizations such as the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, and in James Simon Kunin's The Strawberry Statement, 1968, he recounts an SDS strategy meeting in which a student gave a report about an SDS convention the student had recently attended. And the report revealed that, and I quote, men from business international roundtables tried to buy up a few radicals. These men are the world's industrialists, and they convene to decide how our lives are going to go. They're the left wing of the ruling class. They offered to finance our demonstrations in Chicago. We were also offered ESSO, which is Rockefeller money. The acronym ESSO is derived from Standard Oil Company. They want us to make a lot of radical commotion so they can look more in the center as they move more to the left, end quote. Now, at first, this seems strange. Why in the world would leading business people want radical commotion and a move to the left? Don't they want economic stability? Well, folks, not if they want to move the consciousness of the people away from nationalism and toward internationalism for a global economy, and not if they are coming to consider human beings as mere, quote, human capital, end quote. In fact, by 1970, Americans were coming to be thought of as human capital by leading intellectuals like Lester Thurow, whose 1970 book entitled The New Socialist Revolution proclaimed, quote, education will be radically transformed in our socialist community. The main emphasis will be on learning how to live and work collectively. The next level is learning some series of skills for one's first set of jobs, end quote. Vladimir Turchenko's The Scientific and Technological Revolution and the Revolution in Education, published in 1976, stresses the need for, quote, linking instruction with productive labor, end quote. Can't happen in America? I beg your pardon. It already is happening in America and has been happening for many years. You see, this is the essence of school to work. The student is only educated to the extent that his future employer requires, which is the way labor and education have been linked in communist countries for decades. For those experiencing difficulty with the idea of leading capitalists supporting leftist labor and educational initiatives, remember, folks, that to the men at the top, there's very little difference between monopoly capitalism, communism, and fascism. In fact, in all three, competition is absent and top-down control is maximized. In the May 1997 edition of the Christian Conscience, Dr. Cuddy cited the words of well-known capitalist David Rockefeller, who wrote, quote, from a China Traveler, end quote, which appeared in the August 10, 1973 edition of the New York Times. He said, and I quote, one is impressed immediately by the sense of national harmony. There's a very real and pervasive dedication to Chairman Mao and Maoist principles. Whatever the price of the Chinese Revolution, it has obviously succeeded, not only in producing more efficient and dedicated administration, but also in fostering high morale and community of purpose. General, social, and economic progress is no less impressive. The enormous social advances of China have benefited greatly from the singleness of ideology and purpose. The social experiment in China under Chairman Mao's leadership is one of the most important and successful in history, end quote. 24 years later, David Rockefeller remains one of the prime supporters of the same murderous communist Chinese regime, which at the time he wrote those words was just completing the termination of 7.3 million units of surplus human capital in Chairman Mao's glorious cultural revolution. The source for that is Death by Government by Professor R.J. Rummel. You can find it on page 100. In the early 1980s, ladies and gentlemen, neither the Soviet nor German socialist education systems had been adopted nationwide in the United States. As Professor Eugene Boyce in The Coming Revolution in Education, 1983, wrote, quote, in the communist ideology, education is tied directly to jobs. No such direct, controlled relationship between education and jobs exists in democratic countries, end quote. However, in 1985, two things happened. At the beginning of the year, the Carnegie Corporation gave $600,000 to establish the Carnegie Forum on Education and the Economy. And later that year, the Carnegie Corporation negotiated the Soviet-American Exchange Agreement for the United States government, whereby Soviet educators became involved in planning curricula of some United States schools. In the winter 1987-1988 edition of Action in Teacher Education, Professors Martin Haberman and James Collins wrote in, quote, The Future of the Teaching Profession, unquote, that, quote, schooling is now seen primarily as job training, and for this reason, quite comparable to schooling in non-democratic societies. Once education is redefined as a personal good and as emphasizing preparation for the world of work as its first purpose, our schools can appropriately be compared with those of the USSR, end quote. Also, in 1988, the Carnegie Forum became the National Center on Education and the Economy, NCEE, with Mark Tucker as president. And the next year, 1989, was asked to help in developing the national education goals upon which America 2000 and later Goals 2000 would be based. In the spring of 1990, NCEE formed the National Alliance for Restructuring Education with its hallmark, the Certificate of Initial Mastery, or the CIM, without which workers, quote, will be condemned to dead-end jobs that leave them in poverty even if they are working, end quote, according to NCCE's America's Choice, High Skills are Low Wages. Are you beginning to understand the message of this broadcast? I certainly hope so. If you love your children, you had better. Anticipating there may be some difficulties in gaining public support for this restructuring, the National Alliance had the Industrial Areas Foundation produce a concept paper engaging the public one way to organize. The IAF was founded by radical Saul Alinsky, admired by Hillary Clinton, who included an acknowledgement to Lucifer at the front of his book, Rules for Radicals, admitting that he is a worshiper of Satan. Relevant to STW, the IAF concept paper states that, quote, schools face the challenges of preparing students for a labor market in an economy that is increasingly global in nature and requires of its workers the ability to be lifelong learners, end quote. Remember several years ago when I told you that the goal of the New World Order is to be able to control you from the day you're born until the day you die, and that the implemented organization for this control will be community mental health centers and schools that eventually will be combined into one organization. And people will literally go to school from birth to grave. But your education will be channeled in the interest of the state and big business, not in your interests whatsoever.